Okay, colleagues, everybody could take their seats and we can start this hearing on financing for development. I'm very pleased that we're going to have this hearing, and we've got two very distinguished panels to talk to us about this, what we know is going to be a key issue in the issue of development policy over the next year. This morning in our committee we had an exchange of views on the issue of financing for development with our rapporteur, Mr. Pedro Silva Pereira, and he's going to actually chair the two panels this afternoon. We know that the talks are going to be crucial in Addis Ababa in July, and we know that the Commission has published proposals now to begin the discussion inside the EU on the financing for development. And in the next few months, we'll be, just so for our guests from outside, we are going to prepare a report. Mr. Pedro Silva Pereira will be the rapporteur. So we are looking to you to give us your insights into, and to the other panel members, your insights into how you see this process, how you think it can be made a success, and of course it's crucial to get an agreement in New York on the SDGs as well. So with no further ado, I'm going to hand over the floor now to the rapporteur, Mr. Silva Pereira.
Thank you, Linda. I want to welcome everyone here today to this public hearing on this very important issue, financing for development. Of course, we are here to discuss how to back up the sustainable development goals with adequate resources. And with us we have a few eminent guests. We'll have two panels. The first one will start with Commissioner Mimica. I would like to welcome you. Thank you very much for being here. Happy to see you again. We know that the Commission has just presented a few proposals in a communication, a fresh communication. So we'll look forward to listen to your comments on this. We also have here Jess Griffiths. You are Director of the European Network on Debt and Development. You've played a leading role in the work on financing for development by, namely by development NGOs. So I'm sure you'll have proposals for additions, and we are now preparing our own report, our own input for the process. So I think you will help us in our to-do list for the EU in this respect. Chris West is Director of the Child Foundation, also a member of the board of the Overseas Development Institute, a number of very important earlier roles, and of course a long experience in these development issues. We very much look forward to hearing you giving us a business perspective and tell us what you think the EU should do. Afterwards, we will have a second panel. It will not be complete, unfortunately, because the State Minister for Finance from Ethiopia yesterday unexpectedly told us that he was not able to participate. But we will learn about the preparatory process from Gail Hurley, who is the expert in the United Nations Development Programme. We are also lucky to have in this hearing the leader of the UNCTAD's Action Plan for Investment in a Sustainable Development Goal, Mr. James Zan. So we have good reasons to expect a useful debate. We are here mostly to listen, so only just a few remarks, saying that, of course, we all understand that this conference of Addis Ababa is of major importance in itself, but because this conference will also set the mood and tone to the other high-level meetings scheduled for this year, the UN Summit in New York, to be held in September for the Sustainable Development Goals, and afterwards the conference in Paris in December to agree new global climate agreement. Of course, that we all surely do support the efforts from the United Nations and the Secretary General in order to build a strong global partnership and a new agenda for sustainable development. And we understand that this has to be done taking into account the principle of shared responsibility, taking into account that the world has changed and global economy has changed in the last 15 years. And so the idea of taking into account respective capabilities now means something different for some countries than it meant a few years ago. Nevertheless, the EU has responsibilities, and we expect the EU to have a leading role in all this process. That's why surely we welcome the communication of the Commission and the political will which was shown regarding development, and also policy coherence, which is very important to achieve our goals. Nevertheless, we had a first discussion, first exchange of views in our development committee this morning, and something that perhaps the communication could have go a little bit further, namely regarding the commitments for official development assistance. In fact, the idea is that the European Union should confirm and support the target of 0.7%, but the timetable should be agreed, and in fact the timetable should depend on the agreement that is expected for Addis Ababa. This approach is a matter for discussion, and we hope from the Commissioner to listen to his views on this, because a leading role of the European Union should perhaps demand a different political position, that is to say that, well, the goal of 0.7% is already known. If we want to make it credible, we have to say something more regarding the timetable and regarding the mechanisms of monitoring in order to ensure that this time it's for real. And perhaps this example would be useful in order to involve other partners. And of course, the debate in Addis Ababa will not deal only with official development assistance. We will have to discuss domestic resources, and that is to say we will have to discuss tax systems and international tax cooperation. We will have to discuss the involvement of private sector and how to align sustainable investment to the goals of sustainable development. So these are major issues for our debate. I will not take you more time at this stage. I will just give the floor to our Commissioner, Mimica, again thanking for his kind presence, and I'm sure you will be ready to present the proposals of the European Commission and also to respond to the first reactions that you've already heard. Thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Rapporteur, dear Pedro, honourable members, ladies and gentlemen. This hearing comes at a very timely moment, I would say. We stand at a pivotal point in the process toward the post-2015 development agenda, with negotiations in New York now in full swing. Over the past year, discussions both at the European Union and at the United Nations level have mostly focused on the substance. There we have already achieved a lot. A set of 17 goals has been proposed by the Open Working Group, which largely reflects the European Union priorities, as laid down in our communication of June last year and the recent Council conclusions from December. The focus is now shifting to the question how. How do we organise our action in order to deliver this new ambitious agenda? And how do we secure the appropriate means of implementation, including adequate financing, to fuel such a far-reaching agenda? Getting the answers right is essential if we want the Sustainable Development Goals not to just exist on paper, but to truly transform the lives of people and our planet for the better. The resolution that this Parliament adopted in November last year called for the European Union to play an active role in shaping the new global partnership that is needed to implement the post-2015 agenda. And the Council conclusions of December 2014 invited the Commission to propose a concrete way forward. We have responded to these calls, and we have done so within the first 100 days of the new Commission, which shows the great importance we attach to this process. Our communication of 5th of February, just a few weeks ago, sets out our vision on the global partnership and the means of implementation. The communication underlines the overarching principles, such as universality and shared responsibility, but it also underlines the human rights, the rule of law, non-discrimination and gender equality. It contains a very clear to-do list for all countries and even more specific suggestions on the forms that the European Union contribution could take. And the communication puts forward concrete proposals for monitoring, accountability and review of the process in front of us. We want this communication to form the basis of strong Council conclusions in spring and to enable the European Union to play a constructive bridge-building role in both Addis and New York track. Allow me to highlight just 3 elements which are at the core of the vision we expressed in the Commission's communication and which I believe can be a useful starting point for our discussion today. First element of the communication is comprehensiveness. The issue of financing for development cannot be addressed in isolation. A clear and result-oriented policy environment is an indispensable condition for any form of financing to have a real impact. In the Commission, we fully recognise the important and catalytic role of the official development assistance, especially when financing the development agenda in the countries most in need. But it should be put into a wider context. Therefore, our communication also underlines the importance of non-ODA policies and means of implementation. What will really make a difference in terms of post-2015 implementation are issues such as the enabling policy environment, capacity development, mobilisation and effective use of domestic resources, including increasing tax revenues, reducing tax evasion and avoidance, fight against illicit financial flows, or financial transaction taxation. Also, international public finance, trade, science, technology and innovation, mobilising the private sector and harnessing the positive effects of migration are just as critical, and so are review, monitoring and accountability procedures. It is vital to ensure full coherence, mutual reinforcement and complementarity between the financing for development and the post-2015 negotiation tracks to arrive at a single, consistent and truly transformative framework in September, which will successfully integrate the three dimensions of sustainable development: social, economic and environmental. Addis should therefore address the full range of means of implementation required for the post-2015 development agenda: financial and non-financial, public and private, domestic and international. And it should become the means of implementation pillar of the New York post-2015 agenda. Second crucial element is universality in contributing to development goals and in external and internal policy coherence for development. The post-2015 agenda signals a true paradigm shift to a development framework that applies to all countries. It is clear that to implement such a far-reaching agenda, business as usual is not an option. We need to be ambitious and put all tools at our disposal to good use. Here again, I believe our communication puts us on the front foot. We stand ready to play our part, and we also want to encourage others to step up their contribution. International public financing will continue to be critical, particularly for some of the least developed countries. The European Union has done a lot since the 2000 Millennium Declaration. We have gradually increased our contribution to reach 0.43% of gross national income for official development assistance in 2013, close to 57 billion euros. That is much above the OECD or DAC average and represents a huge increase despite all financial odds, up from 0.32% in 2000. The European Union collectively has consistently accounted for more than half of global ODA. We should be very proud of this, especially during a period of very difficult financial circumstances. And yes, these constraints mean that we are below trajectory to meet the target. But our message in the Commission communication is very clear on maintaining our ambition. We believe the European Union, along with all high-income countries, should meet the 0.7 target. We also think that emerging economies have a responsibility to contribute to the development of the poorest countries. The world has changed since 2000, and this should be reflected in fair burden sharing. We also need to put greater focus on innovative financing instruments so as to help leverage more private sector engagement. By strategically combining our grants with public and private financing, for example, we have helped unlock investments with an estimated volume of 40 billion euros in partner countries and with a leverage rate of over 20 times. There is certainly great potential there, which we cannot afford to leave untapped. As we move to a truly universal framework, all actors need to take actions and contribute their fair share to reaching the global goals in line with their respective capabilities. The third and the final point I would like to highlight is the need for a true multi-stakeholder partnership. The success of the post-2015 development framework will not just depend on governments. The private sector, as well as the civil society, will have a key role to play in the implementation of this agenda. We want to see the new agenda supported by a strong accountability framework, allowing for the comprehensive monitoring of all actions to ensure an effective use of resources and a greater focus on results and impacts. Transparency at all levels is of critical importance, and the involvement of this Parliament and of national parliaments worldwide will be vital in this respect. I very much look forward to your committee's report, which can indeed provide very useful input as we approach the peak of the negotiation process, starting with this first exchange of views today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. It was a very interesting and comprehensive presentation. I'm sure that you'll be ready to answer a few questions in a minute. Now we would like to hear some comments on our other guests. From our other guests, we'll begin with Jess Griffiths from Eurodad. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to speak. I think the first thing I want to say is I very much agree with Mr. Pereira and Mr. Mimica that the Financing for Development Conference is incredibly important. And I think it's important not just because of the topic, but because of when it is. So it will come before the 2015 conference and before the climate change conference. And so therefore the success of those other two UN conferences depends very heavily on success at the Financing for Development conference in Addis. So if we get a good result in Addis, that will help build momentum on 2015 and on climate change. If we get a bad result, we could see the collapse of those other two processes as well. And for the G77 group of developing countries at the United Nations, the FFD summit is absolutely critical because these are the issues that matter most to them. Now, I was asked to give some response to my reading of the Commission's communication on this topic, and unfortunately I think I have two views about the communication. One is it's either very disappointing or it's a dangerous strategy. So I think it's disappointing because it contains very little concrete actions that the European Union could take to move the agenda forward. So if that is really the European Commission's starting point, it's very disappointing. But maybe it's possible that this is a negotiating tactic and they want to hide what they're really willing to go to, in which case I think it's a very dangerous strategy, because we have less than half a year left until Addis, and so we're wasting valuable time when we should be engaging with developing countries on the issues that they would like to see on the agenda at Addis. And so if I could highlight 4 topics that I think will be critically important, which are both important for developing country governments, the G77 group at the UN, and also for the 150 civil society organisations which produced a paper at the end of last year calling for ambitious outcomes in Addis. And those are the topics of tax, private finance, debt and aid. And so these are critical examples for me. So first, on tax, what we really need to get out of Addis is an intergovernmental tax committee. Now, I'm sure you're all aware of the importance of this topic, and we know at Eurodad we did some research at the end of last year, and we added together all of the inflows of finance to developing countries, so the aid, the private finance, the remittances, and we found that for every dollar that flows into developing countries, 97 cents flows out through illicit financial flows. And most of those are linked to tax evasion involving commercial entities. So there's a huge problem of tax evasion, but there's also an enormous problem of tax avoidance. And if we don't tackle these 2 topics at Addis, then we won't be making critical progress. Now, at the moment, the venue chosen to discuss these is the OECD, and I think that is a mistake because, first of all, that excludes the majority of developing countries. And when we think that at the centre of the problem of tax avoidance and tax evasion are tax havens, what are we saying to most countries if they can't even be engaged in the discussion about how to tackle these issues? We're encouraging them to think of themselves as outside of the system, which is exactly where tax havens situate themselves. So in a sense, we're encouraging people not to engage, or countries not to engage in global discussions. And we shouldn't also forget that there are many tax havens in the OECD, thinking of Luxembourg, Switzerland, the British Overseas Territories. So for me, it's a bad place to be doing international tax negotiations, and that's why I think we need an intergovernmental tax committee at the United Nations. Now, this proposal is supported by the G77. It's in the elements paper that the UN has produced to kickstart discussions. It's supported by a vast coalition of civil society organisations, and I hope it could also be supported by the European Union and by the parliamentary report. So that's the first issue on tax. The second on private finance. Here I think we really need to change the terms of the debate, because private finance flows in developing countries come with heavy risks as well as potential rewards. And those risks are very often brushed over or ignored, and yet the G77 very clearly states that the risks are at the centre of what they're worried about, and the ability to manage private finance is critical. So let me give you some examples. So since 2009, more money has flown out of developing countries in repatriated profits on foreign investment than new foreign direct investment has gone in. So there's a risk of who is actually benefiting most from foreign investment. And we also know that foreign investment, particularly portfolio equity flows, can be highly volatile and is normally the main trigger for financial crises. So these types of risks are extremely important, and the ability for developing countries to manage those risks should be at the centre of the discussions. And yet, unfortunately, when we engage in discussions about private external finance in these kind of forums, we often end up talking about simply how to get more foreign investment into developing countries. And that is only a part of the discussion. And if you don't talk about the risks, then I think you are actually adopting the wrong strategy, which is why we've been very critical of the Commission's promotion of more blending of aid to incentivise private finance. Well, firstly, because we see a poor track record of this kind of use of ODA. It tends to be very intransparent. It flows mostly to middle-income countries. There's very little evidence of the development impact, and it's often very untested. But also because there's a huge loss if you use your aid money to do that, and that is the ability to use aid to do other things. And actually, if you look at all of the evidence on what drives foreign investment to developing countries, the investors will tell you we want well-educated workforces, healthy workforces, good infrastructure, large markets, and these are things that depend very heavily on public services provided by public investment. So I would make a suggestion that actually a traditional focus on aid for public investment would be more sensible. So in private finance, I think we really need to change the terms of the debate. Third, on debt, we have a unique opportunity this year to make progress, permanent progress on resolving debt crises. And you may know that in 2012, developing countries reached the highest debt stock levels ever of 4.8 trillion, according to the World Bank. And we still have over 40 low-income countries in debt distress or at risk of debt distress. It remains a critically important issue, but thankfully the solutions to this are already on the table at the UN. There's a process to set up a multilateral framework for sovereign debt restructuring, which will be finished before September this year. But unfortunately, European countries have been very slow to react to this and are mostly abstaining or sitting on the fence, and we really need Europe, which after all knows exactly how debt crises can go on for an awfully long time and cause a lot of damage if they're not well managed, could be making a positive role on this important process. So fourthly and finally on aid, I very much agree aid is still incredibly important. So for low-income countries, aid remains at 10% or around 10% of GDP. It's an essential part of the financing they use and that they need. However, of course, the 0.7 target is not up for discussion. It will be reaffirmed at Addis. Everybody knows that. Every UN process always does that. That will happen. The question is, can we get better mechanisms for ensuring these targets actually get met? And so in 2005, European countries promised to meet 0.7. And here we are in 2015, and as the Commissioner points out, we're a bit above halfway there. So can we get binding targets? And also on the quality of aid, can we get a target, for example, to untie all aid? So we know that the IMF suggests that tied aid reduces the value of aid by 25%. If we could untie aid in policy and in practice, it would be worth an awful lot more to the poorest countries of the world. So that's my proposals. I hope some of them at least find your ears. In summary, I think it really is time for the European Union to step up to the plate, and that requires making concrete proposals to go further, to actually commit to do things, including an intergovernmental committee on tax, a change in the way we talk about private finance to recognise the risks as well as the rewards, support for a debt workout mechanism to speedily and fairly resolve debt crises, and some binding targets on aid. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much indeed. We will discuss, of course, your suggestions in a minute. We'll now move to Mr. Griffiths. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and good afternoon to everyone. I think, as you said in your opening remarks, I'm probably here to give a perspective from the private capital dimension of this debate on financing, and I think I'll try and frame my remarks around what I see as some risks involved in working with the private sector and engaging them more in financing for development, but equally some opportunities. And I think some of the opportunities I will present will be diametrically opposed to where Jesse says there are risks. So hopefully a little bit of debate coming out of this as well. Just to frame my remarks, I'm director of the Shell Foundation, an independent charitable organisation clearly managing private capital. We adopt a very different model to traditional philanthropy. We seek to find business solutions to global development challenges. In our case, those linked to the core footprint of the energy industry, so access to energy by the poor, job creation through the small and medium-sized enterprise sector, and sustainable mobility in particular. What do I mean by a business or an enterprise-based approach? For us, that is seeking to work with and incubate new pro-poor inclusive business models with partners who share risk with us and who share goals towards delivering sustainable and scalable solutions, and by that I mean ones that are financially viable ultimately. We provide an integrated blend of business skills support, finance in whatever form is appropriate, so that's grant, equity, guarantees, whatever form is appropriate, as well as access to market linkages for our partner. So there's concept of more than money support. We obviously work with partners to track performance, not just against pre-agreed development targets, but financial performance targets. And finally, we assist partners in terms of their scale-out efforts through seeking to leverage capital from other sources, predominantly private capital, but equally public capital, so that they can stand on their own and exit subsidy dependency. Now, that approach has led us to, I think, be one of a small number of organisations that has a portfolio now of social enterprises who are operating at global scale, tackling big development challenges that historically were the preserve of the state or the not-for-profit sector to address, and they're doing so in ways that are financially viable and delivering significant scale of social impact as well. Some of you will have heard of the terms of venture philanthropy and impact investing, and our approach, which we pioneered back in the year 2000, is very synonymous with venture philanthropy and in impact investing. And I think because of our track record, we have, in the last few years, established public partnerships with various donors, the UK Department for International Development, USAID, Inter-American Development Bank, who are now passing money to us to co-manage with respect to ourselves and themselves on shared objectives. So some of what I'll say relates to public-private partnership models. What I would say, and touching on Jesse about some of the risks, what have we found? If you're innovating new business models or solutions to big global development challenges, these are not easy. They do not happen quickly. It requires considerable patience, flexibility and grant support for those to achieve their objectives. Secondly, often the earlier adopters or the first beneficiaries of these business models are not the poorest of the poor. So you see a trickle down over time, but it's not an immediate impact on the bottom of the pyramid. And thirdly, in our experience, these inclusive business models seldom generate commercial rates of financial return. So they are not immediately attractive to commercial investors. And I think I'll frame some of my remarks around how I think the public sector and the EU in particular can work more with the private sector around some of our experiences. So first comment I would say is that I think in the world at the moment there is ever more philanthropic capital becoming available. Considerable amounts in many forms from many people. I would say that there is a particular role for the European Union and indeed others to advocate for those philanthropic capital providers to employ or deploy models aligned to venture philanthropy models, because in our experience that is far more impactful and delivers far greater scale of social benefit than traditional philanthropic approaches based on short-term project-based funding. I think the European Union is well placed to do this, both because there is the European Venture Philanthropy Association that is espousing and promoting these messages, and secondly, the OECD DAC equally is promoting venture philanthropy as a modality. So I think there's a significant opportunity for the public sector in the EU to try and persuade those with philanthropic capital that it can be most effectively and efficiently deployed through adopting venture philanthropy approaches rather than traditional approaches. Secondly, I think, related to that, a lot of philanthropic capital is neither aware of nor aligned with the MDGs or indeed the proposed Sustainable Development Goals. And I think there's a significant opportunity here to advocate for greater alignment between philanthropic capital and for some of the targets that are being discussed here today. Second issue I'd say is a risk. I think over the years I would say that there has been a remarkable shift in how the private sector engages in tackling social issues away from what I would regard as more traditional corporate social responsibility towards focusing resources on issues aligned to the core business strategy or footprint. In my terms, it's shifting from corporate social responsibility towards corporate social opportunity, trying to use those monies to do things that complement what the business is doing. I think this is very effective for the private sector, but it does risk, in one way, a non-alignment with a focus on sustainable development goals, because the issues that the private sector will focus money on are clearly ones related to business footprint. Unless, of course, there is an alignment between business footprint and sustainable development goals. Equally, I think from the private sector as a whole, there is far greater interest now in trying to understand the linkage between different sectoral issues rather than specific sectoral targets. So, for example, there is great interest amongst many cross-private sector organisations in understanding and addressing the energy, water, food nexus. for them that becomes an area of risk, but equally of opportunity. So if there isn't a clear linkage to a sustainable development goal, then accessing capital around that will become more difficult. The third point I would say is I would argue that historically the very best of the private sector is exemplified by innovation, risk-taking and entrepreneurship. To some extent it's behind mobile phones. Everyone I'm sure has heard of mobile banking. M-Pesa, essentially a disruptive thinking by the private sector. But at the same time, as we all know, none of these interventions, none of these transformational changes occur without significant public sector support. And here I think the public sector can play an incredibly critical role in trying to support innovation and disruptive thinking that has at its heart a business approach, but where the public sector can de-risk some of that innovative thinking. For example, in our context, we as the Shell Foundation have incubated a number of social enterprises who are now global leaders in providing affordable modern energy services to the poor in emerging economies. USAID came to partner with us because they felt that their money could augment these social enterprises in their growth and scale up and transfer and expansion into other markets. So it's a very effective way of de-risking the scale up of successful business models that have very clear social benefit but are equally not yet at the point of becoming financially viable. And I think there's a significant opportunity for the public sector to de-risk innovation with a focus on transformational, disruptive business solutions to big global development challenges. Fourth point, whilst I think innovative or inclusive business models show very good progress in delivering significant social impact at scale, most, in my experience, are not yet delivering financial rates of return that make them attractive to commercial investors. And therefore, possibly to take exception or put a different slant to what Jesse was saying, I see a huge need for blended financing models to address what is otherwise a valley of death or a gap between successful innovation that cannot scale up and reach the point where it can access commercial capital because the rates of return are too low. And if we're really to address this gap, then we need the public sector to provide blended financing instruments, not just the public sector but philanthropic capital. Blended finance in the form of first loss guarantees, in the form of returnable grants or convertible grants, in the form of patient equity, in the form of social impact bonds or development impact bonds. In other words, innovative financial structuring to offset the or allow these innovative models to go to scale and critically leverage capital. We've worked on a number of these ourselves, these tiered capital structures. We find them incredibly helpful. For example, we have worked in structuring a large fund to support start-up and growing businesses in Africa that create the jobs and other services in these economies. The partner cannot do this in a way that attracts commercial capital. So we created a patient layer of capital from ourselves. The German government came in alongside us and created a very patient layer of capital. And that allowed us to access over $100 million of commercial capital and as well as capital from European development finance institutions. And without this blending of finance, we wouldn't be able to get these vehicles to scale or fruition. So I think it's a huge opportunity and one where we need creative thinking. Finally, I'll talk about public-private partnerships. I think, again, there is really good evidence of these working very well. I think the key criteria for success relate to when there is a clear focus to the partnership, where there is shared goals and clear pre-agreed performance metrics, where there is shared risk amongst partners, where all partners bring something more than money to the table. I think money is necessary but not sufficient for a public sector or private partnership to function well. and where there is a clear accountability structure to deliver on milestones and agreed performance targets. So I think there are some exceptionally good examples that are illustrated in the Sachs report, for example, but equally there are some examples where public-private partnerships don't work. In my experience, that's where there's inflexible procedures on the part of one party, lack of clear decision-making, and overly complicated governance structures. So I think there are extremely good models for public-private partnerships that can be replicated and where organisations like the EU and others can play a significant part. So in conclusion, I think that the private sector has a considerable amount to offer towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. I think if we can harness the innovation, risk-taking and entrepreneurship of the private sector and blend that with public sector finance to de-risk that and allow it to go to scale, then I think we have a huge opportunity to do things in a different way and in a collaborative way that in the past we haven't really tapped into. So I probably would end by saying I applaud what other speakers are saying, but from my side as a representative of private capital, certainly the idea of blending capital in from the public sector to these models is absolutely critical to success and meeting the SDG targets. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. I told you that we will listen to different perspectives, and that's the way it goes. Now time has come to have some questions and a short debate. So if you want to ask for the floor, please do. Linda McCavan, you have the floor.
Thank you, and thank you to our panel of speakers for bringing the different perspectives. I have a few questions. Firstly, for Commissioner Mimica. We've been told we understand, and I think now we've discussed several times in our committee, that ODA is only a small part of the solution for development. It's only, and we know that if we increase tax revenues by 1%, it's the equivalent of doubling ODA. So we know that the ODA is only a small part of the answer for financing for development. But we're also being told that unless we in the EU sort out our position on the 0.7% very clearly, we'll get stuck on that. In the whole discussion will be only about the ODA side, and we won't get on to talk about the other things that we need to talk about. We won't get on to talk about domestic resources and the private sector. And I think Jess said it actually, that in fact what will happen is that if we don't get it right in Addis, it could colour the whole discussion in New York and then again at the climate talks in Paris. I was in Copenhagen and we saw there that I can understand on the one hand the EU doesn't want to put all its cards on the table too quickly in negotiations because it thinks it has to negotiate. But on the other hand, unless we create an atmosphere of goodwill in Addis, this could affect the other talks, because for the G77 they will be seen as part of the same process. They won't be seen as separate negotiations or separate issues. I think the whole things will become linked. And we have very good relations with our ACP partners and developing countries, and so we need to be seen as being on their side in Addis in order to then have them on our side in Paris for the climate talks. So I wonder how you see the discussion going on the 0.7%, given the very difficult financial climate inside the EU, and how the Commission intends to move forward in persuading the Council to be tough on the 0.7%. Jess, you talked about the private sector, the risks, but you didn't really spell out what the risks were, or maybe a bit clearer. What are the risks? I mean, maybe you should comment on what Chris said, actually. That might be more interesting. He's put forward his view of how the private sector could work, and he talked about these philanthropic, venture philanthropy, etc. What do you think about those things? Do you think they're risky? Do you think they're smokescreens for the private sector getting public money to do what it was going to do anyway? And I suppose to Chris, I mean, I hear what you say. I mean, it'd be useful if you gave us some concrete examples of what you're talking about. I find discussions a bit kind of words on paper, you know, venture philanthropy. What does that mean? Give me an example. Tell me something that happened somewhere where a venture philanthropic project did what, where, that wouldn't have happened anyway. But I suppose maybe a bit provocative to you. You talk about the private sector and the public sector sharing the risks. What about the private sector sharing the benefits of what it does? I mean, because we are part of this, we're going to go to the developing countries and tell them their tax base has to increase. Part of the problem they have is getting the private sector to actually pay a fair share of tax. We have that problem in Europe. We're having a big debate about it in Europe, you know, going to dominate the political discussion here. So when you work in the private sector, do you monitor not only the projects and the benefit and the risk sharing with the public sector, but do you monitor how much tax return there is to the countries you're working in, and what share they get of the profits, and how that benefit that gets down to ordinary people to pay for the sort of things which ODA is paying for? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I give the floor now to Mr. Rubik. You have the floor.
Ja, recht herzlichen Dank. Ich glaube, dieses Hearing.
Thank you very much. I think the advantage of this hearing is that we are actually able to plan for the future. And this is the European Year of Development here in 2015, and that's the best time, I think, to really create the right structures for that. I have a question to the Shell Foundation. Now, creation of jobs in developing countries. Well, what about traditional family firms? What's the role that they play, and how can we then give them incentives to build up structures, SME-type structures, so that the existing expertise can actually be made use of?
Mrs. Ryan, you have the floor now.
Grazie molto, Pedro.
Thank you very much, Pedro. I'd like to thank you for your contributions, which were all very interesting and full of information. Taking account of the fact that this discussion is looking ahead to the Addis Ababa conference, we will be continuing this discussion not only on the report on financing to development, but also a report specifically on the subjects raised by one of the speakers on tax evasion. This discussion has to be held together. I was pleased to hear that the Commissioner referred to the importance of having more stable, more fair tax systems, and obviously the subject of dealing with illicit financial flows. We have heard about this from Eurodad and also many other organisations, and we now understand how these problems could make our work ineffective. That is, development aid in general could be rendered ineffective. And so we need to make further efforts to find new instruments and new solutions, particularly as regards, and we really need to look at this in more depth, and we will do so in the coming weeks in a seminar in which many of us from this committee will be taking part. But from this point of view, my concern is what I said earlier. It's the European Year of Development. It is a time when we have got the Addis Ababa conference, and we've got the one on SDGs and development after 2015, and we'll be also having the conference on climate change. So I do share your concern. If Addis Ababa doesn't find concrete responses to these fundamental issues, then we run the risk, obviously, of seeing all these other appointments in Paris and New York being weakened as well. So the Commission should play a guiding role. We've always said that, and I think that the Commission can push for a more ambitious position. I do hope we'll do that. because obviously what we need is much greater involvement. We really need to focus on this problem. So I'd like to thank you, and I hope that this is the spirit in which we'll continue this work. Thank you.
Okay, I will now would like to open the floor to the public if anyone wants to comment before we ask our panelists to react. If that's the case, it's not mandatory. Okay. If not, I would like to raise two questions, and they have to do with this target of 0.7%. The issue was raised. Is it a tactical matter? Is it more than that? Is it worse than that? We have to understand that the Commission presented a communication which is intended to be adopted by the Council. So in the end, the Commission is in the hands of the Council of Member States. And we all understand the difficulties of the process. But the question is, if we want to encourage other partners to assume commitments, what is the best way to achieve results? Is it to do as the Commission is proposing? Let's support the 0.7 target, and let's left the discussion on timetables for the general agreement with other partners? Or is it to present the European Union example and to be able to present our own timetable and our own mechanism of monitoring in order to ensure that this time it's for real? This is the strategic issue regarding ODA for Addis Ababa. And if the European Union will want to have a leading role there, then this strategic choice has to be made, and I would like to have the reaction of the Commissioner on that. Secondly, the conference of Addis Ababa is meant to be a diplomatic conference where political decisions will be taken. We all understood now that there will be speeches and there will be papers. And papers are getting better. They are being much more comprehensive. They are considering all the aspects. But in the end, we expect political decisions. For instance, we are saying domestic resources are fundamental, and the improvement of tax systems is essential. And for that purpose, we must have international cooperation. The question is, which political decision will be taken in Addis Ababa in order to fulfill these goals? Which political decision? Is it just a political statement that tax systems are very important in order to obtain additional resources, to fight inequality, this and that? Or is it any political decision? Suggestion was made, an international, an intergovernmental body within the United Nations. I would like to ask the Commissioner if that would be a possible political decision, if you are considering other options, because we know the European Commission has a strong work of cooperation with many countries also in this respect. But for the global governance, what are we in fact suggesting to be decided in Addis Ababa? Thank you. So I will now give the floor to the panelists. Who wants to start? It's up to you. Jess, please.
Thank you. Very important questions. I think I'll focus on the ones on tax and then the ones on private finance. And I think your question is absolutely right about what kind of decisions can actually be made in Addis. And it's not a binding intergovernmental agreement. There's no legal nature to this, to the agreement. So decisions that set up processes that take the issue further forward are critical, and that's why Intergovernmental Tax Committee is so important. That will give developing countries a space to actually engage in important discussions of how to make international tax system fairer, how to tackle the topics of tax avoidance and tax evasion, which are in many ways the defining topics of the discussion. But they can also make commitments to meet other targets, and that's where I think the aid, making the aid commitments is binding is important, but we shouldn't, I think as several people say, let that dominate the discussion, because there's so much more that can be gained. But of course, and this is why I would really like to see the Commission and the Member States taking a more proactive role in making proposals, but they can also take a proactive role by doing things and leading by example. So it was wonderful when the European Union agreed to introduce country-by-country reporting for the banking sector, so that now we can see where banks make their money on each country in which they operate. And now we need to take that to the next stage forward and have it for all sectors. And I know, hopefully, that will be a hot topic of conversation in the years to come. So that was on tax, but I really do think the Intergovernmental Committee is something we can achieve in Addis, and it would really change the nature of the discussion and give developing countries a stake in that discussion. On private finance, actually I agree with quite a lot of what Chris says, but maybe for slightly different reasons. But I think when we talk about risks, it's important to distinguish between macroeconomic risks and the kind of microeconomic discussions that Chris is talking about. And it's those macroeconomic risks that are incredibly important for developing countries. So if you've read This Time is Different, the Reinhardt and Rogoff book about debt crises over the last 100 years, it shows that sovereign debt crises arise very often out of crises in the financial sector. And it's financial sector crises that often trigger terrible problems for developing countries and also, as we know, for developed countries. And very often those are triggered by flows of international capital. And so the Asian financial crisis was triggered exactly in that method, and many other crises have been triggered in that way. And so if countries can't manage that risk of inflows and outflows, then they open themselves up to devastating consequences. So the risk is huge, even if it's smaller than the rewards they might get. So that's one risk. But other risks include, we know there's many examples of foreign investors being able to use the scale of their power and also their connections to developed country governments to get favourable tax treatment, which undermines, therefore, companies from within those countries who don't get the same tax exemptions. There's risks in terms of the social environmental impacts, and we know, for example, foreign investment in the poorest countries is very heavily focused in extractives and oil and sectors like that, where there are often huge environmental and social impacts. And then there's risks of not getting the kind of investment you need, and that's why I think developing countries are calling for the ability to manage and direct foreign investment. So you need it in certain sectors or certain areas, and how do you incentivize it to go there? And so for me, that's the macro risks should be at the center of the discussion, but the micro risks are a completely different topic. So actually I think one area I would disagree with Chris is we're not talking about de-risking. There's no such thing as de-risking. There's a question of transferring risk, which is what I think he's talking about. Transferring risk to the public sector. Or using blended finance to subsidize the public sector. That's what we're really talking about. Now, I'm not opposed to that. I think that is a very sensible development strategy if adopted by the developing country. You know, we've seen how national development banks, agricultural development banks, etc., can adopt these kind of strategies and, as you say, innovate and incentivize the private sector to invest in the right places. And we also know that most private investment in developing countries is domestic investment. So in 2012, domestic investment was 35% of GDP in developing countries. Foreign direct investment was less than 5%. So most of what we're talking about is how to incentivize domestic investment to do good things. Unfortunately, this type of model, where we should be talking about the developing country leading and working out how to incentivize and promote the right kinds of investment, is not what we're talking about. We're always talking about how to use blended finance to support foreign investment, which, unfortunately, the practice shows mostly goes to support OECD firms to get a subsidy or to transfer the risk of what they're doing. And I don't think that's the answer to the question. So for me, I agree entirely. We should be trying to encourage private investment, but we need to do that within the framework of ownership at the national level, and that discussion is often very absent.
Thank you very much. Chris West, perhaps you would like to react as well, and
okay.
Perhaps comment also on what can we do more in order to ensure the alignment of the private sector with the Sustainable Development Goals.
Yeah, okay, I'll try and answer the two broad questions. So turning to the first one, which touches on what Jesse was saying about the risk with the private sector. I mean, I sit here managing private capital registered as a charitable organisation, so to some extent very aligned with the public sector interests. And for me, the criticality of this relationship is how do we ensure that we maximise, that private gain is incidental to public benefit, and that public benefit outweighs the private gain dimension. So I'm obliged as a charitable organisation to measure that and account for that. It's my belief and it's my experience that when we have funded for-profit social enterprises, the scale of the social impact is far in excess of that when we've worked with charitable organisations. And the private gain is relatively minimal for the reasons that I said, that most of these business models are not commercially viable. So I think your point around managing the trade-off between private gain and public benefit is absolutely right. In my experience in these areas, that I think you can manage, you clearly have to manage and measure the development impact to track that. But from my side, and I think my advice and recommendation to others here would be that some of these nascent social enterprises offer the most efficient, effective and impactful ways of delivering social change whilst minimising risks of undue private gain. Related to that, I think you asked for some concrete examples of, say, venture philanthropy versus classic philanthropy. Let me make a generalisation. I think one of the problems that has historically plagued the charitable sector is it has relied on short-term funding that is restricted both in its length and restricted only to support certain charitable activities, which means that the majority of charities have no ability to meet their core costs, are expending huge amounts of time trying to raise other funds to operate, and cannot raise commercial capital or any other forms of capital to grow. Now that, to my mind, is actually impeding their ability to provide public benefit. When I look at venture philanthropy, what I mean by that is let's take an approach that is trying to build up the core competence of those organisations with the skills to deliver the products or services that they offer. We move away from project thinking and we try and ensure that they have the resources to manage their operations in ways that actually free themselves from constantly having to raise capital, and they can build up the competence to execute in a professional way. So venture philanthropy for me is very different to, say, buying the services from a charitable organisation to provide a particular product or service over a particular time, and then them having to come back and say, can we have some more money, to saying, can we build up organisations with the resilience and the competence and the funding structures to enable them to continue to provide those services in a lasting and more impactful way. So there's a fundamental difference. And I think for me, traditional philanthropy is very much of the way in which the traditional donors used to work, short-term project-based funding. I think if we're going to tackle sustainable development goals, we have to shift to a more meaningful and, in my view, business-like way of building up organisations with the competence to deliver those products and services. So that, for me, would be my difference. The last point was, I think, for me, personally, as someone who comes from a small enterprise background, I mean, clearly I hugely resonate with the importance of the SME sector. And I think when people talk about the private sector in emerging economies, I think often when they're thinking about big multinationals. For me, the private sector in developing countries and emerging economies is the small and medium-sized enterprise sector, which is grossly undeveloped. Historically, everyone has thought that the challenge to growing that sector was that it could not access capital. And yet the reality is that the real challenge to growing this sector is not the lack of entrepreneurs in any country in the world. It's the fact that they need a combination of business skills support, that they need risk capital because they do not have the collateral to go to a bank to get it, and they need the support over a longer period of time to enable them to grow, which is why, for me, the SME sector is the engine of job creation, it's the engine of economic growth, it's the engine of innovation. And it's massively significant for both the public sector and the private sector to work on. For the private sector, it's the source of jobs, it's the source of supply chain diversification. For the public sector, it's all the reasons that I've just alluded to. Now, this is where it's easy to say what the problems are. Problems are access to skills, access to capital. Then the problem is, how do we find business solutions to these challenges that integrate the provision of skills and finance to this market segment and do it in ways that can deliver some financial return so that they actually become able to scale up over time. And there we see the problem as being the very few partners that operate who can do this. When they do it, they can't do it in ways that generate significant financial returns, which is why I revert to the fact that we created an African partner to specialise in doing just this in Africa, but we needed a tiered capital structure involving the public finance alongside philanthropic capital to create that blending tiered layer that allowed us to leverage the capital in to allow it to operate at scale. So I completely and utterly agree that the SME sector is important. I would say, and I think you alluded to it, that what we really need to try and do is lift people from the informal sector, which in my mind is survival, to the formal sector, which is tax paying, formally registered, and where I think issues of accountability as to what happens with money earned and private gains can be much more open and transparent. So I 100% agree that the SME sector is one area that aligns the private and public sector enormously, and where we need to collaborate on effective but scalable models.
Thank you very much indeed. So I will now conclude the panel. I give the floor to the Commissioner. Commissioner, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you. Let me start by addressing the very nature or purpose of the Commission's communication. I hope nobody missed one sentence in my statement when I said that the communication is to be translated into Council conclusions, which means that there are at least two tracks of negotiations in front of us, one with the member states within the Council or before the Council, and the other one along the lines of the New York and Addis negotiations. So therefore we really try to reach the balance in our communications that would make the Council conclusions quite concrete and quite ambitious. We of course have to take care of the fact that the communication will be basis for the negotiations, for the negotiating positions, for the negotiations tactic, even strategy, and therefore at this very moment we might not come to the very concrete or very open proposals or very open issues that some might have expected of this communication. But definitely we shall develop on this communication at a later two stages of council negotiations and post-2015 negotiations. When it comes to Addis track, it is, I'm afraid it is quite clear, and I'm aware, or even I'm afraid that and I'm concerned that there is a jeopardy that the Addis track might end up only about the ODA targets, and this is what we, as a European Union, as a member states, would like and what we are going to avoid, or at least to contribute to avoiding that Addis would be about the ODA only, because our comprehensive approach is much more than the ODA only, not because we are still lagging behind the trajectory of 0.7 and try then to move the attention to other means of implementation, but because it is really because we see that this comprehensive approach is the only way to address and to assist the development agenda, the development needs of our partner countries. Therefore, 0.7 target, at least when it comes to the European Commission, our proposal, our recommendation to the Council, to the Member States, is very clear. Let us recommit to 0.7 collectively, and let us leave the negotiating room for time frame, for setting the time frame for this target, and also for bringing on board all other developed countries or high-income countries and emerging donors or emerging economies to a certain level. We even went a bit further in the communication than just proposing recommitment to 0.7. We went a bit further in terms of recommitting to or committing for ODA for least developed countries to 0.15 or 20 within a certain time frame, and also we avoid recalling the fact that nowadays there is a lower level of commitment for let us say so, new members of the European Union to 0.33. Our approach is 0.7 recommitment for all collectively. For me, this is not a technical issue. This is even not an issue of fiscal or financial negotiations or budgetary negotiations, let alone this is not an issue of negotiating member states' contribution to the EU budget. It's really about a political commitment, taking a political direction, taking a political way forward in terms of ODA targets. And therefore, leading by example is our approach. Of course, we shall all have to wait until the Council's negotiation on it, but when it comes to the Commission, or even I would be a bit more limited to my own view and approach. I see that what we what the leading by example should mean is recommitting to 0.7 and setting the timeline not too far into future, and by such a commitment, let us try to get other commitments for the first time, commitments from other developed or high-income countries. This won't be an easy goal and easy target, but even if the outcome of Addis would be that European Union would be the only one to appear after Addis with a commitment to ODA target, this won't be a step forward, definitely. But this won't be also the end of the financial for development track if we manage to really to develop this comprehensive approach to all means of implementation. Therefore, European Union, its member states and the Commission should be and must be actually the one to be very clear and very ambitious and very constructive in Addis and in New York. For me, this is not a tactical issue, even not on recommitting and on timeline and on whether to commit conditionally or unconditionally. This is not about tactic. It is about the strategic approach of the European Union for the future development goals. Therefore, we are ready to open a number of other issues in Addis and in New York, especially when it comes to mobilizing the domestic resources, then on tax. Tax avoidance, tax evasion, but not only in a let us say nice language or nice proposals in the outcome document, but we shall be ambitious enough to have as concrete means of implementation on these issues as possible. You should also follow what the European Union or what the European Commission is about to do and to prepare on tax evasion, on fair taxation, on tax avoidance. Very soon, we already had an orientation debate in the college. Very soon we shall, I would say, do our homework, because we can't be credible enough in Addis or after or beyond Addis when asking or assisting even others to do something that we are not doing at home. So therefore these issues of taxation and the concrete proposals how to implement it, either through this high level intergovernmental panel or any other concrete method or tool, will be part of our contribution to the Addis track. Of course, whenever it comes to taxation, it's very much about the member states and their approach. But I hope, and I will do my best together with other colleagues from the Commission to make these issues, this comprehensive approach, to make it acceptable and to make it a common European approach in the forthcoming negotiations and in our overall post-2015 development agenda. So, therefore, if you look at the communication, I would say that it is ambitious. It is more ambitious than the very open working group proposals under 17 goals. I don't like to be squeezed into defensive corner when it comes to assessing the level of ambition and the concrete contribution that European Union or European Commission could offer to the new Sustainable Development Goals agenda. I really think that there are enough arguments that our ambitions could be and shall be translated into a global agenda that will actually address the major development needs and major development partnership that is now in front of all of us in order to not only to shape the sustainable development goals, but to really implement it in real life.
Thank you very much indeed, Commissioner. Thank you very much for coming and for your explanations. We will work together in the next few weeks in order to prepare the position of the EU, and I'm sure the European Parliament will support your efforts in order to get a leading role from the EU in this process. Thank you also to our guests. It was a very interesting and useful debate. As you know, we have a second panel, only with 2 interventions, so we will continue immediately. And I will conclude now this panel. Thanking again our guests. Thank you.